everyone, I'm Kelley, I'm the flutist with MISE-EN, and this is Mark, the trombonist. And we are very happy to be here talking with you guys today. We're going to be discussing the extended techniques on both flute and trombone. I have brought with me a lot of flutes. I have the contra, the bass, the alto, the flute, and the piccolo, and I'm going to be demonstrating on all of them today, so hope you enjoy. Mark has brought 2 trombones and a whole bunch of mutes. I'm not sure if you can see them, but they're all around him on the floor, so should be a good time. So we are going to start kind of comparing and contrasting the extended techniques that are possible on both flute and trombone. So that includes tongue ram, flutter tongue, singing and playing, air sounds. Those can all be done on both instrument families. So, Mark, did you want to maybe demonstrate some tongue rams?
Oh, sure. So the tongue ram on the trombone, it's really not that difficult to do. It's accomplished by basically just jamming the tongue between the lips, and it's then amplified by the trombone. As you move the slide, you hear the pitch change. When you produce the tongue ram, it's resonating basically the fundamental for each position. So on a tenor trombone with an F attachment, you have 7, or a range of a 7th, I should say, from B flat down to C. On a bass trombone where you have 2 valves, you actually have a whole octave worth of tongue rams. Because of the addition of the 2nd valve.
Great. So on the flute, tongue rams have different resonances based on which flute you're actually using. Like piccolo has a very small tube, so it doesn't have a huge amount of resonance. So it's going to sound very hollow. Versus on the contra, you're going to get this huge resonance because the inside of the flute is very big. So I'll demonstrate on all of them now. So those are tongue rams. The main thing to remember about tongue rams is I can only do them in the 1st octave of the flute. Anything above that, you're just going to get the resonances of the lower pitch. So our next is flutter tongue. So Mark, did you want to demonstrate flutter tongue?
Sure. Flutter tongue at this point is not really what I would necessarily consider an extended technique. I think for brass players, at least, the first time it shows up is in a tone poem by Strauss in the late 19th century. But it is a way to modulate the sound. Basically, I'm sure you've probably heard it, you're just rolling your R inside your mouth at the same time that you play. So one thing to keep in mind as you are using flutter tongue on the trombone is that if I need to change notes and you want an articulation, that means I need to use my tongue to separate the notes. And if I'm also using my tongue to flutter tongue, then getting a clear articulation can be difficult. So flutter tongue is most effective either on a glissando or if you're doing a slur like in a harmonic series. also be very effective. Just something also to keep in mind is you're playing in the very low range with a flutter tongue, like the speed of the vibration of the flutter and the vibration of the note actually gets pretty close, and it can sometimes create a little bit of interference. So as you get into the valve range, and especially into the pedals, the notes can be very hard to focus. And so by the time I get to G, like for me, it's very difficult to maintain the pitch as well as the flutter. And if you wanted both of those, it would require like probably a fair amount of practice for me to get those out clearly. And the flutter tongue sounds basically the same on the bass trombone as it does on the tenor.
Great, yeah. So the flute is basically, I have the same kind of comments. It's not necessarily an extended technique. It's pretty standard now. But it does sound on the entire range of all instruments. I can do flutter tongue. I do run into the same kind of articulation problems because I'm using my tongue. So anytime I want a separate articulation, I actually have to stop my air and start again. So it's never going to be a very fast articulated thing. The actual flutter tongue is the articulation that's happening. So I'll demonstrate. And that's going to about to sound the same on all of them. But I just demonstrated basically what would happen if I wanted to do multiple articulations of a flutter attack. So our next thing we're going to talk about is singing and playing. So Mark?
The singing and playing on the trombone is probably my favorite extended technique. And it's something, again, actually, that is not necessarily modern. Brass players have been doing this, I think, mostly as a stunt since at least the early 19th century and maybe even the late 18th century. So the details are a little fuzzy. Anyway, but it's something that's been happening on buzzed instruments for a long time. The idea of singing and buzzing at the same time on didgeridoo has been around for a very long time. The kinds of problems that you run into when you are writing for both a trombone player who's playing and singing at the same time, something to keep in mind is most trombone players are not trained vocalists. And so when we sing, it is more difficult to control the voice. Also because the air column is doing two different things at the same time. You're causing the lips to vibrate, and you're also causing the vocal cords to vibrate. And when the pitches are very close together, that can create some interference, which is a beautiful effect, but can also be very challenging. So things that work really well and are pretty easy to do are singing open intervals, like perfect intervals, like octaves and fifths. Thirds also work well. Tenths are great. And when the intervals are in tune, you also get really nice resultant tones. A really cool effect that sounds great is when you play and sing a note and then drift away either with the voice or the slide. So if I were to sing and play an F, you can hear the beats increase as it gets farther away, and that's just the two waves interfering with each other. Also in singing and playing, mutes can really make a nice addition to the sound, and maybe my favorite one is a Harmon mute with the stem in, and that gives you a lot of nice color options. And it also takes care of another problem, which is balancing the volume of the voice against the instrument. The instrument is almost always going to be louder, and so hearing the voice can sometimes be a challenge. And while mutes don't generally, mutes shouldn't be thought of as affecting the volume of the trombone, they can help with that issue in this particular instance.
Very cool. I love the way that sounds. So flute and singing while we're playing is tricky. We can do things like Jethro Tull, right? Do like the very rock and roll distortion thing. And that is produced by singing loudly at the same pitch that we're actually playing. So this is that. So that's cool. The other thing that we can do is something that's more delicate. A composer that I love, his name is Riza Vali, and he writes with voice and flute. That is beautiful, and I should have thought about that for doing today, but I didn't. But that he uses the very soft flute noise and the very soft singing, and he works them in a kind of conversational way. And it's very beautiful, and it gives a kind of feeling like this. It can be very eerie, and you can get these beatings where you can sing very, very close to the actual sound. And I wouldn't say that it is quite as controlled as what a trombone can do, because I don't have that slide. And being able to roll in and out while retaining the vocalized vibration in my vocal cords is actually very difficult to do. And actually, some flutists can't do it. It's definitely a developed skill. And then our next thing to talk about would be air sounds.
Yeah. So on the trombone, there are a couple of different ways to make air sounds. First, just blowing through the instrument without vibrating the lips at all, but the lips are still on the mouthpiece. And one way to change that sound, you'll notice when the slide moves, the pitch changes a little bit, but once you get more than maybe 5 feet away, the change in pitch becomes almost inaudible. And especially if I'm in an ensemble where the sounds need to cut through, oftentimes what I'll do is slide the instrument, remove the instrument slightly from my lips, and then blow straight into the mouthpiece cup, which can be a much louder sound. And that also gives me an option to change the consonants that I'm using to shape the air. I can use like a sh or a f, which also change it, and then we can add different kinds of articulations, ta, ka, which give you some other options in terms of sound as well. One last thing, which I don't necessarily like to do, but gives you another option, is to take the mouthpiece off, reverse it, and then blow through, which can be a nice sound, but it is a little gross because I'm taking something out of the mouthpiece or out of the trombone and putting it into my mouth. But also, you need to allow enough time to turn this around to get it into place without damaging the inside of this. I mean, the mouthpiece is like the most important part of the trombone in a certain kind of way because it's where the vibration starts. And if there's like any kind of sharpness here on the receiver, that could damage the inside of the mouthpiece. So that's something that you should, tread sensitively about. And if you're commissioned to write a piece or thinking about using it and you know the player you're writing for, maybe talk to them about whether that's something they feel comfortable doing.
Very, very cool. So air sounds on the flute, very similar. I can add a whole bunch of different syllables to the air that we're creating. I can do soft, I can do really loud. The one thing to be careful of with air sounds on the flute is it takes a huge amount of air. So if you want me to make a really loud crescendo with air sound, you must be conscious of the time you want me to do that, because I can't really do it longer than you can. If you can go, and that's as loud as you can do it, and as long as you can do it, I might be able to go maybe a little louder and a little longer because I've practiced it, but there's only so much because of human capability. So that being said, I'm going to demonstrate a few different ways to do air sound on the flute. So as far as air sounds go with the flute, basically anything that you can imagine, I probably can do it. The one thing that probably is I would not recommend, and you actually see it a lot, is when you want an air sound that has no resonance and you don't actually hear a pitch. And that is not actually possible. I can make an air sound as much air as you want, but you're always going to hear the resonance of whatever finger combination I have down. So outside of just taking the flute out of the picture and going, I mean, there's always going to be the resonance of the flute, of the actual instrument. Okay, I think that is it. Did I miss anything?
No, I think that's it.
Okay, great. So then I'm going to kind of take over the show for a little bit. I have some pieces that I want to talk about and demonstrate for you guys. And so, let's see. We good? So the first piece that I want to talk about is a piece by Ian Clark called The Great Train Race. And it was written in 1993, and it uses kind of that Jethro Tull singing, playing thing I demonstrated just a little while ago. It was written for C flute. And one thing I want to focus on with this little segment is trying out these pieces that I've chosen on instruments that were actually written for, and then trying them out on another instrument and actually seeing how that changes the piece. What does it do to the piece, and how is it better? How is it worse? So if you guys have any comments, any suggestions, if you want to hear something else on a different flute, please by all means comment on the Facebook or the YouTube. We are monitoring those, and we can definitely take suggestions. So the first slide that you see is the last page of The Great Train Race by Ian Clark, and it was written for C flute, so I'm going to start out on C. So that's super fun to play. So we've got the air sounds, we've got singing and playing, we've got articulation, we've got a multiphonic at the end that is supposed to sound like a train. I don't know if you caught that. So I'm going to try to play it now on bass. So it almost becomes a completely different thing, right? You can still hear it, it still sounds the same. I don't know that I like it better on bass or flute. Probably I like it on flute because you can hear it and it's very, very clean. Typically when you play a bunch of notes on the bass, it can be a little muddy. But there is that. Okay, so the next piece I'm going to play is by Kaya Sariaho. It was written in 1998, and it was written for alto flute, and it's called Couleurs du Vent. So the excerpt that you see, I'll be starting right at the top. Yeah, so no problem. Okay, this is on alto flute. All right, so alto flute, Kaya Sariaho, and now I'm going to try it on regular C flute. Kaya writes a lot for C flute, so I wanted to compare what she wrote with the alto versus the flute, how it would actually sound on something that is going to work with this little bit smaller key mechanism. It's going to be maybe a little bit cleaner. So here it is on C flute. All right, so for those of you with perfect pitch, I'm very sorry, I forgot to say the alto flute is in G and the C flute is in C, so that was in a different key. I'm not transposing. All right, so the next one is a piece also written for alto flute, but on a totally different idea. It's totally different. And it was written by a friend of mine named Jacob Gunnels. It is a really, really cool piece. You should check it out. If you want to play it, let me know. I'll get you in touch with him. Super awesome. But this piece was written for alto flute. It's called Ka. It was written in 2011. microphone, sorry, forgot. So that's that. That's only a very, very small part of it. It's a pretty long piece, but it uses syllables in a more kind of beatboxing, quick accented kind of way, and is very cool. So I thought that I would try this on contra. Which to me is super cool. I don't know how clean it is to you guys, but to play it, it's like, it's my jam. Okay, next piece. I'm going to play a little bit of the opera for flute by Sciarrino. I'm going to play the third movement. So this piece was written in between 1977 and finished in 1998. It has a whole bunch of movements, all with extended techniques. If anyone has any questions on like how to notate extended techniques, he's a really good resource. Like, look at this piece. It has basically any extended technique that you could possibly want to write. He's pretty much has standardized that. So this one, we're starting out this little tiny diamond, or triangle note head is what it is. Yes. This is very, very fast tongue pizzicato. Okay, so that's that first 4 lines. And then we jump down to another segment of this, which is actually jet whistles. It's very, very fast jet whistles. And it goes in between loud and soft jet whistles. So that is actually notated by the height of the arrows, which you can see. One thing to note that Sciarrino is all about silence. And so this piece is actually very, very quiet. So even the fortes are not necessarily forte. So you'll have to listen up. This piece is written for C flute. Okay, that's a very small portion of that. This piece is actually very exhausting, so I didn't play the entire segment of what I put on there. I'm going to try it out on bass flute. So this is this piece on bass. That takes a ton of air. Okay, next piece. This piece is written by a friend of mine named Dominic Karski, and it is written for a bass flute, And it is essentially all extended techniques. So what you see here on the page is key clicks and tongue rams and inhales. So it's meant to be amplified right now because of the setting right now. We are basically amplified, so all good on that front. And it's written for bass flute, so here it is on the original instrument. Again, super cool piece. You guys should check out his music. Very, very cool. Okay, so I thought that I might try it on contra because the keys on the contra are humongous. Okay, here it goes. And that is Streamforms by Dominique Karski, first played on the original instrument bass flute, and then on contra. Okay, so my next piece and final that I'm going to talk about today is a piece by my friend Sonjin Hong, and it is written for solo piccolo. Let me just pull it up here 1 second. Okay, so this is two clips of the piece, so it's not a straight piece of music. So it's part of the first page and then part of a few pages later. So the first 3 lines is the opening of the piece, and what she's done here with these half circles is to show the amount of in and out of the position of the flute. So I'm rolling in when the hook is down, and I'm rolling out when it's up. And with the fingering that I'm using for this, I'm actually able to produce a C and a D simultaneously. Okay, she's also using bisbigliando, a timbral trill here. Okay, so, and then the second excerpt, we have tongue rams and some air sounds that are closed on the piccolo. So we'll hear how that sounds, and then I'm going to demonstrate it on the alto flute, which again is in G, so not the same key. All right, so first piccolo and then alto flute. So that is Fruscio by Songjin Hong. It was written in 2016, written for piccolo. I just tried it out on alto. Honestly, I think both are really beautiful. I actually really love this piece on piccolo. It's so light and it's just beautiful because you don't really hear pieces that are written for piccolo and use this really quiet form of it. And this is probably one of my favorite pieces. That being said, if anyone has any questions about what I did, about the extended techniques that were used, please feel free to reach out either in the comments or shoot me an email, kelly@MISE-EN.org, and I'm gonna pass the mic to Mark to talk about the trombone.
I would like to call this segment of the workshop all the questions you wanted to ask about the trombone but never did because you were either too lazy or maybe embarrassed or maybe both, or maybe there are questions you didn't know that you had. First, I would just like to talk about 3 really great resources for anybody who's interested in writing for the trombone. The first is a book that's written by Stuart Dempster. Stuart Dempster is a seminal figure in trombone history in the 20th century. And he had an insatiable curiosity and was always experimenting and trying to find new ways to make sound on the trombone. And he wrote a really great book called The Modern Trombone, A Definition of Its Idioms, that was first published in the 1970s. It's still published by Acura Music. If you're looking for it to buy a copy, I suggest not buying it on Amazon because apparently there are only used copies available and they're about 3 or 4 times what it should actually cost. If you could go to the next slide for me. Great. And then the next book is called The Techniques of Trombone Playing, which is published by Barenreiter. And this was a collaboration between the trombonist, American, now living in Switzerland, Mike Svoboda, and the composer Michael Roth. And this is incredible. It's basically a catalog of the sort of like the current realm of extended technique on the trombone, and in terms of like figuring out what notation should look like, or if you have a question if something is possible or is not. I mean, Mike is very comfortable in saying, you know, what works, what doesn't work, what works for some players but not all players. And the book is laid out in a way that is very, very clear. And the nice thing about that book is also there are recorded examples of etudes and all the extended techniques online. The last one is by Dominique Delahoche and Thomas Rockton, and that's called The Trombone in the Composer's Imagination, another great resource. So just thinking about some things that I encounter frequently, the first thing that I would really like to address is range of the instruments. So you'll see that I have here with me a bass trombone and a tenor trombone with an F attachment. This is only a part of the trombone family. In addition, there is an alto trombone, which is pitched in E flat, a 4th higher than the tenor trombone. There's a soprano trombone, which is basically a slide trumpet, which is exactly 1 octave higher than the tenor trombone. And then there is a contrabass trombone. And currently, there are basically 2 different versions of a contrabass trombone that are manufactured. One is in B flat, an octave below the tenor, and it has a double slide. It's very large and awkward to play. And so the second version of the contrabass trombone is one that's pitched in F. It's much more manageable. It's still very heavy and somewhat cumbersome to play, but sounds great. And the contrabass trombone gets used a lot in opera repertoire, but has also been used a ton in movie scores. And some composers now are doing some really interesting things with the contra. But probably the most common that you will see are tenor and bass. And these 2 instruments are really very similar. The only thing, in fact, that distinguishes them is the diameter of the bore of each instrument, the bass trombone, of course, being slightly larger, the diameter of the bell being larger on the bass trombone, 9.5 or 10 inches as opposed to 8.5 on the tenor trombone, and then the addition of a second valve. In terms of range, both these instruments have a very similar range. The tenor trombone can play from C1 all the way up to F5, but when we're talking about the lowest notes on tenor trombone, because the instrument is smaller, they will have a little bit more bite, and they might cut a little bit more, but even as you get to the extreme low range, some of those notes don't respond as well or have the same richness as they do on bass trombone. So for example, let me just start out by playing some pedal notes. So these are the same on both the tenor and the bass. So these we call pedal notes. These are the fundamentals. This is from B flat, it would be B flat 1 down to E1, and we'll hear that now on the bass trombone. You can hear on the bass trombone there's a lot more body, the notes speak more readily. And then as we get down into the lowest notes, down to C1, down even to B flat 1, there is still a defined pitch there. Sounds a little bit like a chainsaw. The tenor trombone can only go down to C1. And it doesn't have the same robust quality, but it is possible to play down there. Now that being said, as you approach the extreme ranges on the instruments, you'll see that sometimes I struggled a little bit to get the notes to come out. So, as you're writing, thinking about the range, the closer you get to the extremes, both the extreme high and the extreme low, the less variation that really is possible in terms of dynamic and articulation. You know, there are only so many ways that I can articulate on a pedal E and still get the note to speak. And certainly short notes don't work as well down there. They need more time to resonate. So that's what the low end sounds like. As we move to the high end, on the bass trombone, technically you can play as high as you can play on the tenor, but the problem is here the issue of endurance and accuracy. Because the mouthpiece on the bass trombone is slightly larger, it makes it more difficult to play in the high range for extended periods of time. So you get a nice clear sound, very rich, full of overtones on the tenor. And as we play the same octave on the bass trombone, the sound is much wider, and you don't have as much it projects, but there's not the same sort of like brightness to it. And as you get higher, the sound on the bass trombone becomes more spread and thin and less focused. And so that range, I would not recommend writing on the bass trombone. On the tenor, it sounds more full. There's a lot more power, a lot more control. But again, even in that range, less variety of like dynamic and articulation are possible. So really, when you're thinking, and it is possible to play both higher on both instruments, but I would not necessarily recommend it unless you are composing for a specific player who you know can play up beyond F5. And this brings us to the next thing that I wanted to discuss, which is how do you choose which instrument you're writing for? And really, it just has to do with the range. I think, you know, as you look at your piece, if it sits predominantly in the lower range, then you would write for bass trombone. It seems like a no-brainer, but there have been so many times in the past when I have received a piece and the composer writes tenor trombone for the part, and everything is like below the bass clef staff, and that really should be a bass trombone part. One other thing that I would like to mention is this note B natural, B1. It's the half step below the fundamental of the trombone. That note does not exist really on a tenor trombone. Because of physics, when you put the F attachment down, basically it changes the trombone from the key of B flat to the key of F. So the bell gets longer, but the slide section does not get proportionally longer. So we compensate by adjusting our slide positions as we go out. So with the valve down, with just the F attachment down, we really have only 6 positions. 6 half steps apart, I should say. There are almost infinite slide positions on the trombone. But to get the B natural on a tenor, you always have to compromise. On some tenor trombones, you can pull the F attachment almost far enough to get a B natural in tune. But you still have to lip it down, and most of the time, for where the instrument is tuned, the B natural exists as a false tone. Which, I mean, you can hear the pitch, you can hear the note, but it really doesn't compare in terms of like body and robustness to the rest of the instrument in that range. Like the notes on either side of it sound so much better that it really sort of sticks out. So if you write a low B natural, you should really be writing for the bass trombone. So the next thing that I would like to talk about are mutes, and there are a wide variety of mutes. And I think that most people have kind of a misconception about how mutes work, in that most people think that mutes only function to make the volume of the trombone less, to reduce the volume. But really the best way to think about a mute is to think of it as a filter. It filters out certain overtones, so it changes the sound of the instrument. The most common mutes that you will have seen are a straight mute and a cup mute. Every trombone player you run into will probably have these 2 mutes. Straight mute and the cup mute, which is a little more covered. And if you want something to be a little softer and delicate, the cup mute has a lovely soft sound. But one thing to keep in mind as you're using mutes, even the straight and the cup, which have been around for a long time and are fairly common, is that they do affect notes on the trombone in certain ways. So as you get into the low range, like certain notes don't speak on the straight and the cup mute. And so it's like I have probably 4 or 5 different straight mutes, 5 different cup mutes, 4 or 5 different harmons, much to my wife's chagrin. But, it's like different mutes work for different situations, and so you're always trying to find the right one. And so as you're writing, just be sensitive to the fact that, you're putting something into the bell of an instrument that is going to change the way it reacts. Some other mutes that are slightly less common, but are still around, a harmon or a wah-wah mute. This mute can be played with the stem in or the stem out. When you have the stem out, you can cover it with the hand and open it. And it gives you like a very clear sound between covered and open, but in the transition between, you can actually hear individual overtones as they pop out. Which is super awesome if you're writing something that is kind of soft and delicate. That can be a really great effect. It doesn't work as well at higher volumes simply because it doesn't project. Without the stem in, you can still do the open and closed, but it is a much more subtle effect. And similar to the plunger, which I'll get to next, if you have somebody working trying to cover the bell here with their hand, One thing to keep in mind is that I am not able to work the valve. So if you need any notes that use the valve, I'm not going to be able to get to those. Plunger is one that's very common, especially in jazz. I love this mute. Can be great, but it does change the pitch. To straighten that out, let me show you what I mean. So especially as you get into the high range, opening and closing a plunger will change the pitch of the trombone by almost a half step. If you add a pixie mute, which just goes all the way in, like that, then you use the plunger over. You can still get the nice change in color, but without the change in pitch. So the pixie mute plus plunger is a great combination. Three other mutes that are possible. One is a solo tone, if you're familiar with the big bands from the 30s and 40s. These next two mutes you would have seen a lot back then. That's what the solo tone sounds like. And then the bucket. And these mutes you do see pretty frequently. The bucket has a great sound. Nice and warm. One thing you'll notice as I'm changing between these mutes is that the physical act of putting the mute on and taking it off requires a certain amount of time. And if you do not leave enough time for me to remove a mute, put another mute in, we're going to have to make choices about what's more important. It's like, do you want to leave the straight mute in? Do you just want to leave it open? Because as trombone players, we're not going to have time to switch. There are ways to, sort of like if a note is in first position or even in third position, I can hold the instrument by the bell or like this and then put the mute in and out. But really that, you should really just leave a little bit of space in order to change the mute, unless a note is in first position or third position. But still, I wouldn't recommend that because it's, all kinds of things can go wrong in performance. The last mute is a practice mute, and this one actually really does make it softer. Which if you have something that is really quiet can be a really great color and texture. We covered a lot of the extended techniques that are similar to, that are shared between flute and trombone earlier. I would like to add a couple of different things. When you're thinking about playing and singing at the same time, it's good to remember that every trombone player probably has a different voice type, and they may not be able to sing the notes that you write. So thinking about different voice types and ranges, it could be good to have an ossia that is maybe a fourth higher or an octave higher, depending on the person performing the piece. Let's see, balancing voice and trombone we talked about. Sorry, I'm just checking through my notes here. Oh, great. So here's one other thing that the flute can't do. If you could advance to the one that says pond, the slide that says pond. If you take the tuning slide for the F attachment out, you can get a really beautiful sound. There's an excerpt here from a piece by William Osborne and Abby Conant called Pond. All right. And they have written, so we're looking at the third line here, and they have written for the open F attachment with just like an X note head. And so when you switch from the full instrument to the F attachment side, it's like all of a sudden you have a tiny bell on your trombone. The pitch doesn't quite line up with the trombone, but with a little bit of practice you can get it to work out. So this line that she wrote here. So we're looking at the third line. Can be a really beautiful effect. So the only thing to keep in mind then is that, of course, if you want any notes that are in the trigger range, you would need to allow time for them to re-engage that slide. On the bass trombone, because you have two slides, you could use that same technique and still have access to one of the valves if it were a dependent setup. But yeah, that would be something you would want to talk to a player about more in depth. One last thing that I would like to talk about before we wrap things up, and this is one that Kelley also mentioned, which is bisbigliando. That can work on the trombone in the upper range. So all brass instruments are built on the overtone series, and as you get into the higher range, those overtones get closer together. And like a French horn, you can do rips in that range, but if you move the slide, you can also approximate what a scale might sound like. And that's what jazz players would call against the grain playing, but it gives you a really nice effect. But for bisbigliando, once you get into the high range, you also have more options. Trombone players call them alternate positions for notes. So I could play F in first, or fourth, or sixth. So you can switch back and forth between those notes. The higher you go, the more options you have. So for like B flat, you've got even more options, and that's bisbigliando. Those are some of my favorite extended techniques. There are others. There are actually a lot of others. I would recommend checking out the books and the resources to see what else there is. And then if you have any further questions, I am always happy to hear what you're working on. Yeah. Well, Kelley, do you have anything else that you would like to add today?
No, I think I have pretty much covered everything I want to cover. Just know that we are available. You can email either of us, Kelley@MISE-EN.org, Mark@MISE-EN.org. My name has an extra E, so if you do Kelley, it will come to me. If you do not, it will not come to me. Other than that, I don't think I have anything else for today.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. We hope that we have answered some of the questions that you maybe didn't know that you had, or maybe that you did have but hadn't had a chance to ask yet. We remind you that we have a concert tomorrow afternoon at 2:30, and yeah, I think that's it. Looking forward to seeing you all in real life once this has all passed. Great, thanks for joining us, and have a great afternoon.